Duarte. I'm a program director at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I'm excited that we are partnering today with the National Child Advocacy Centers to bring this webinar to an audience that I know is mixed. I know we have a few judges on the line, hopefully other court professionals, as well as those working with CACs. So this is a really great opportunity for us as organizations to demonstrate our partnership, but also to bring some new information to the field that maybe hadn't been thought of before. So courts and CACs working together and what that might look like. Our objectives for this webinar are that after participating, participants will better understand the purpose, philosophy, and services of CACs. And I think we're probably going to use a few acronyms throughout, so please feel free to chat if you don't know what an acronym is. I think most people understand CAC to be Child Advocacy Center. If others come up that you don't understand, please be sure to mention those. We also want you to identify how you might evaluate the CAC as a partner in your work. If you're a court trying to be a more trauma-informed court, how can the CAC inform your work and also be a partner in what you're trying to accomplish? We want to we hope, although it's only an hour, that this can begin, you'll begin to think of strategies for engaging CACs and other partners that may be able to help you create a continuum of trauma responsive services and processes for children and families in your community that may have experienced some type of victimization. Sarah gave us a great tutorial of the web room, but I do want to emphasize there is going to be a section for question and answer that you can chat towards the end, but feel free to ask questions throughout, and someone will be monitoring that, and we'll get that information to our speakers. And there's also some files to download, and those might be referenced later, but you'll see those on the left-hand corner of your screen. There's a bench card for the trauma-informed judge that we worked on with a partnership with the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. So I want to start by getting you engaged and asking a question of everybody on the line. How familiar are you with the CAC model in your community? And you'll see a poll that should be coming up on your screen now. The first response is really like, what is a CAC? It looks like many of you come from CACs, so that might not be your response. And then down all the way to the fifth, which is I'm very familiar with the model. I know the services front to back, and I know how the CAC has been utilized in some of the cases. We'll give a minute for that poll to begin to fill out. Well, thank you for filling that out, and if you haven't yet, please do so. We're going to come back to it a little bit later, especially during the question and answer section. So wherever you are at on that continuum, we want to engage you in the webinar, and we want to know more about what your experience has been with CACs and what questions you have with CACs. So I want to mention our speakers. I probably should have done that earlier, but Chris Newlin, the Executive Director of the National Children's Advocacy Center, is going to speak to us first a little bit about the model, and then we'll have Judge Lynn Tepper from the 6th Judicial Circuit Court in Florida. Judge Tepper works on a variety of projects with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, one of them being Project One, which she's going to go into more discussion of, and that's an effort to try to make more coordinated court systems so that families aren't experiencing different types of courts and different conflicting orders. She's also a judge in the Quality Improvement Center for research-based infant and toddler court teams. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris to help us learn more about CACs and the trauma-informed system.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody who's able to be on today as I'm going to go through creating a trauma-informed system, the important collaboration between CACs and the courts. This is a project that the National Children's Advocacy Centers and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges have been discussing for quite some time, so we're actually really excited, for Judge Tepper and I are really excited to be able to share some thoughts with all of you in regards to this. Now, for those of you that may be familiar with Children's Advocacy Centers, I just am going to cover some important topics of that which I think provides a background for Children's Advocacy Center. So here, the nice slide you see is reflective of maybe what, some things that were happening in 1985. You can see kind of down at the lower left, that's what Air Jordans looked like back in the day. Kind of bottom right, you got a nice picture of Steve Jobs when he had a full head of hair. Some of you on the call, I don't know, somebody on the call might actually be represented in that picture up in the upper right, which is some young ladies getting ready to go to prom. I'm not sure that a lot of women today would enjoy having those. The Bears were winning the Super Bowl back then, and kind of a younger Mel Gibson. And then we've got a couple of interesting folks here. You see kind of the bottom photo and then the one in the middle, which is kind of interesting. But why do I show this picture of 1985? Well, this is the same time that the National Children's Advocacy Center was developed, the first CAC in the world. And this was at a time when there was a lot of things, undergoing change within our society. We began to had already had the rise and fall of Steve Jobs. We had a number of things happening in our society back then, and we have come a long way since then. But this is just the context in which we were. Child abuse was not really known. It was not really talked about. It was still something that we were coming to grips with as a society. So the old way, back in 1985, and the kind of the approach was that it was really focused on agencies. The individual agencies were focused on what do I need from this child for my agency or my organization. So law enforcement, just what do I need, and I'll get that from the kid, and then I'll do what I got to do. And we very much operated in a siloed fashion, without much interaction between the various partners. In fact, almost little interaction. And it was, kind of challenged that maybe this isn't the most effective way for us to respond. So the Child Advocacy Center model was really built on two primary tenets. Number one is that the protection of children must involve multiple agencies. Child Protective Services can't do it themselves. Law enforcement can't do it themselves. Prosecutors can't do it themselves, physicians, medical professionals can't do it, that all of them can play an important role, and all of them are actually needed in order to help make a meaningful response and intervention. That was the first. The second is that the system, whatever that system is, should actually help children and not cause them more harm. Unfortunately, probably many of us may have had experiences where children were more traumatized by the system that was intended to protect them than actually assisted. I remember, a case I'll never forget in my life with a young girl, a teenage girl who had been sexually abused twice by her father, who one day looked at me and said, when I was seeing her in therapy, and said, if I had it to do all over again, I wish I hadn't told. And as she described that, she said that, what her father had done to her was not as bad as what the system had put her and her family through. And it really kind of caught me off guard to think that that what the system had done was worse than one's father coming in and touching them between the legs on multiple occasions. It really is a sad indictment of what the system was doing to children at that time. So Bud Kramer founded the Child Advocacy Center model. I apologize for skipping ahead on that. Instead of each individual agency working alone, the concept was we need to have the various agencies who have a response for engaging in responding to child abuse allegations to work together in a child-friendly setting. And instead of any one agency being in charge and kind of ruling over everybody, that we should have a collective understanding, an interagency agreement or an MOU that really defined how we were going to work together and recognizing the value and importance of each other's roles, and that this interagency agreement would really serve as the guiding force for what we as a collective could do, that what we could do together as a group, as a group of multidisciplinary professionals would be far better for both our own individual agency outcomes and especially for the clients who we were here to serve. So here's a photo of the very first Children's Advocacy Center on Lincoln Avenue in downtown Huntsville, Alabama. And you can see that it was intended to be very much a child-friendly setting. It was supposed to look like a house so that children could come there and feel comfortable and not feel like they were going to a sterile institutional setting, but also to help coordinate the services in this one environment. So what does the Child Advocacy Center actually look like? I've given you kind of the background philosophy behind it, but what is it that's actually done in a Child Advocacy Center? And there's 10 standards, which are developed, accreditation standards developed by the National Children's Alliance. So I want to quickly go through those 10 standards. The first is having a child-appropriate, child-friendly facility. What this means is having a setting where children aren't overwhelmed when they come to it, that it actually is physically safe, it's psychologically safe, and that means that children aren't coming there with the alleged perpetrator necessarily, that they're not allowed to come, that when they come there, it's not a crazy environment with people running all over the place, that it's secure and they feel safe because sometimes children have been threatened. So actually this is a picture of our children's building where we provide direct services, and all referrals to a CAC will come either through law enforcement or Child Protective Services, who when they receive a case will make that referral into the Child Advocacy Center. And if you walk in the lobby of our CAC, this is what you'll see. It's intended to be different than maybe a police station or a CPS office or a hospital. It's intended to be a very child-oriented, child-friendly setting where children come in and they feel like it's a place for them. Because what we want to do at this point is to reduce their anxiety. If the lower their anxiety can be, the more likely we are to elicit accurate information from them. For any of us, when our anxiety is high, we're less capable of sharing information that we may necessarily know. And just think about the very first time you presented in front of a group. It can be overwhelming and intimidating. But the more you do it, the more you become comfortable. The second standard is that Child Advocacy Centers are conducting forensic interviews. So this is where we're doing an interview of a child that is legally sound, by a neutral professional who's eliciting factual information from a child. And not only eliciting that, but the other intent is that we eliminate the duplication of activities. Instead of having a child interviewed by a number of different people, we want the child interviewed the first time by somebody who's well-trained, and for that interview to be recorded. Let me put it in a different context. If a police officer goes to a crime scene and at the crime scene finds a large pool of blood, what is it that person necessarily should do? Do they kind of, put their finger down in it and then put it to their mouth to taste it to determine if it's really blood, mixing their DNA with the blood? No, they don't. Do they allow people to walk through it just because that's the shortest distance to the other side of the house? No. It's protected. You put some tape around it. You make sure nobody interferes. No other DNA gets mixed with it until the professionals, the crime scene lab, is able to come collect the information, collect the blood, get a sample so that they can actually test it. In some ways, think about that blood on the floor much like a child before a forensic interview. We don't want a lot of other people mixing their DNA with it before we actually do that forensic interview to find out what may have happened. And having that done by a professional as opposed to just someone saying, well, I scooped some up with a ladle I found in the kitchen and put it in a plastic baggie. That's not as helpful as having really quality evidence collection. The next one is to have a medical evaluation. This is a specialized evaluation. A lot of times people say, well, this is very focused on evidence collection. And there is a role of evidence collection in some cases, but most cases are non-acute cases. The yield of medical evidence is typically less than 5% of the time in non-acute cases will you find any medical evidence. There's broader issues here, looking at the well-being of the child, do they have other medical issues, and just the issue of them, a medical professional, being able to assure a child that their body is okay. The movement is towards a medical exam being done in every single case. If we do an interview, we do a medical exam because you never know what will happen. For example, we had a case here at the National Children's Advocacy Center a couple months ago where a 7-year-old boy had been anally sodomized by his cousin. And we were doing a medical exam, and during that medical exam, after it was over, the medical professional was telling this young boy that your body's perfectly okay. I've looked you over from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, and everything's perfectly okay. And the boy, with a look of disbelief on his face, almost shock and surprise, much like maybe Chicago Cub fans last night, said, you mean I'm not pregnant? And while that's sad and shocking, he did not understand necessarily. All he knew that is somehow people got pregnant because a penis went in their body, and he thought that maybe he was pregnant. So just that medical evaluation was able to inform him that to take away all of those issues that he was carrying around in his mind. The next is the multidisciplinary team, and I mentioned this earlier, but it's a core function of a child advocacy center. Everybody has a different role. Everybody has a different focus, but being able to attend to the needs of the child while making sure that everybody gets the information that they need is critically important. Then, moving more into the healing side is the mental health standard, which is that children who've been where there's allegations of abuse who have come need to be able to receive meaningful treatment to help them recover from what they've experienced. And this is the strong move is towards having evidence-based mental health services. Traditional, go to therapy every other week and play checkers and just talk about whatever is not really helpful for kids who've experienced trauma. Everybody should be familiar with what evidence-based practice is in the area of mental health. The most common therapy used that is demonstrated clearly to be effective is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which has a very strong outcome data for kids to actually help recover. The next, and here's just kind of some examples of scores for the kids we've seen over the last 4 years, and you see that pre-treatment versus post-treatment, there's dramatic declines in their symptoms that they are reporting related to the trauma. And that's what we want, kids to be less symptomatic so they can go on and lead very productive lives. Another standard, the sixth standard, is about victim advocacy and support, and this is about really helping engage and support the family through what may be their most difficult challenge they've ever faced. This may be the most difficult, overwhelming thing this family has ever experienced, and being able to engage them at the time they come and continue to maintain engagement with them to be supportive of them is critical. Most families don't really have a whole bunch of friends they can go to and get meaningfully valuable advice from their peer group on what to do when my child's been abused, potentially sexually abused. So being able to have someone they can go to. And much like if anybody has experienced having a family member or yourself with cancer, many people are moving towards having what they call a medical navigator, which is someone who basically is your advocate, holds your hand through everything. If any issues, you call that person. They knock down any roadblocks. They get information that you need. They make sure that all the appropriate questions are asked. That's what this victim advocate does for families and children when they've experienced abuse and are being served by a CAC. The next is case review, and this is where the multidisciplinary team is actually coming together as a group and discussing cases to make sure we're sharing information, working as a coordinated group, that we actually are doing all we can to limit any additional trauma to the child and family. So that is a critically important opportunity to make sure that the team is cohesively functioning as it was originally intended, and making sure we make good decisions about what should happen in the future. Not just looking at mistakes and, what did we do wrong there, but actually discussing cases in a proactive manner so we plan for the future. Then child advocacy centers are expected to have a case tracking system where they are being able to develop, have a software tracking system for, their cases so that they can see all of them, be able to do follow-up as necessary. The next is organizational capacity. This is about having a structural organization that's able to support, actually run the CAC. And a growing issue going into the next year is the importance for that organization to also provide support for vicarious trauma, recognizing that all the various professionals involved may experience some level of trauma as a result of this work, and being able to intervene so they can continue to do this challenging work. Now, the final standard is related to cultural competency and diversity, and this is very important as we continue to live in a growing multi-ethnic, multilingual society. Basically, the CAC needs to be available and have access to services so that any child that lives in the community can receive quality services at the Child Advocacy Center, regardless of what their religious beliefs are, the language they speak, what cultural practices they may observe, to make sure that the CAC is humble and has humility around culture and recognizes that we need to maybe modify some of the things we do to meet children and families wherever they are. So the CAC model has spread. There's more than 900 children's advocacy centers across the U.S., served over 320,000 children last year alone. Those numbers have continued to grow over time. There are also CACs are operating in 26 countries around the world, built on this model that started in the U.S. So the question is, does it work? Does this really help? And in simple terms, the Department of Justice has been a supporter of CACs and has supported the evaluation of children's advocacy centers over the last 7 years. And what we have seen is, overarching, I'll tell you, every single study about the effectiveness of CACs and multidisciplinary teams in response to child abuse has found positive impact. Not one article has been published that suggests that the model is not having its intended outcomes. So I have a very few minutes left, so let me just kind of share what those are. Communities that had a CAC had significantly higher rates of coordinated investigations between CPS and law enforcement, more recording of forensic interviews, team interviews being done in a child-friendly setting. They also had higher satisfaction rates. So children who actually were interviewed at a child advocacy center described themselves as not at all or not very scared significantly more often than children who were seen in a different type of setting, and caregivers were happier. And anybody who's involved in investigating child abuse knows that you want to try to keep the caregivers on your side and satisfied with the efforts that are being undertaken so that you can continue to engage them in the process. Also, children who come to CACs have increased access to medical care and are more likely to actually receive those services than in a non-CAC type setting. Law enforcement perspectives, they have faster charging decisions. A community that has a CAC, 80% of those cases, a legal determination is made in 80 days about which direction they're going to go, as compared to much lower percentages in communities that don't have a CAC. And prosecution rates. In communities that have a child advocacy center and actively utilize it, they have dramatically higher prosecution rates for these cases, and that doesn't negatively impact the conviction rate. It's not like they just start charging every single case. They charge more cases, but they continue to find the same percentage of cases guilty. So what they're doing is really taking that middle group of cases, the difficult cases, and able to actually move those into successfully prosecute. And all of these standards are highlighted within the annotated bibliography that we did in coordination with the National Children's Alliance and using our Child Abuse Library Online, which has over 120 pages of all the research that supports why these 10 standards are so important. And then finally, it's cheaper. Now, most times in our society, whenever we do something, we engage in something, it typically is we get better outcomes, but it costs a lot of money. What we do in eliminating the duplication of services is that we actually, in that elimination of duplication of services, we actually save money and have a more efficient process. We're actually using a CAC. Cases, it costs $1,000 less per case to intervene. Now, one final thing, and then I will be done. One slide. And let me give you the scenario as my time is about to expire. An 11-year-old girl interviewed at a child advocacy center regarding allegations of abuse. She's sexually abused by her uncle, and her uncle, as a result of this abuse, is going to be a suspect. She's interviewed at the child advocacy center, and after that, she asks if she can go right on the sidewalk with chalk, and she asked if it's okay to do so, and she said, yeah, it's fine to do. You just need to make sure it's okay for other children to see. So when the interview is completed and the investigators come out from the meeting with the mother following that, but it's not showing up. That's stupid.
It's showing up. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it is showing up.
Okay.
It's not showing up on mine. But if you see this, you can kind of see a very poignant step, and for whatever reason. So at the bottom step, though it may be hard to see, it says, for children who step on here, it says, when you step here, you have faith. And the second step says, when you step here, you have hope. The third step says, when you step here, you're not afraid. The fourth step says, when you step here, you are loved. And the last one is, when you step here, you are ready. So research, shmee-search, whatever you want. What this says to me is that the Child Advocacy Center really does make children feel much more comfortable, and it's exactly what we should be doing to look out for their well-being. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Crystal, who I think will introduce Judge Tepper.
Judge Tepper, it looks like you are set to go.
All right.
So I will leave it to you.
And you'll be moving my slides forward?
I believe, yes, Sarah will be doing that.
Okay. Well, we're ready to talk about what happens when a child advocacy center is not used. And I'm sure those of you who have come to the bench or not on the bench now and have the experience of not having such a center in your area, or law enforcement or child protective investigators electing not to use one, it can be quite traumatic in terms of the outcome, as well as the outcome that was outlined by Chris in terms of the inefficiency and the likelihood not only that it's not going to be a successful prosecution, it's going to unfortunately trigger a child who may be there as a victim, and unfortunately you'll see in the example I'm going to give you that officers that don't have trauma training are have no skills to approach a child so that the child isn't re-traumatized, so that the child doesn't, they don't understand a child may not be in a position to be answering questions, as opposed to the individuals who have all the great trauma training that you find in a CAC. The example I'm going to give you, I need to caution you as we're about to bring that up. This was a recent case that I had in a child delinquency case in which this child wrote this statement, and it is very, it may be hard for some of you to read, but I should read it to yourself. But the bottom line is this is a child who's 14 at the time. She has written this statement with a law enforcement officer previously, not at a CAC. And she uses the word raping, and her brother is a sex offender. And she's explaining why she didn't tell her mom. Now, this is written because she has shown up at her aunt's house. She's been on the run. As you can see, she's running away. Her mom doesn't believe her. So here she is. Her aunt has called the authorities. This is written up, and now the child starts being quizzed by this untrained officer who's allegedly trained to handle child crimes. This is what the officer says to her. And mind you, this officer was on the stand. We had an adjudicatory hearing in this case because this child, as a result of this inquiry by the officer, was charged with false report. So imagine this is an officer with this 14-year-old, wants her to start detailing every detail of the years of abuse. And what a surprise, the child says, I don't want to talk about it. And the officer is telling me on the stand during this adjudicatory hearing, oh, you just blew it off. Adjudicatory hearing in Florida would be the trial, a non-jury trial for a delinquency case. and the child making it known, if this officer had the proper training, would have been clear that this child just wanted to go crawl under a rock. And after the child says, I just don't want to be here, then it doesn't end there. In fact, the officer starts questioning whether you've been raped. And the child just trying to, this is the officer repeating on the stand what the child said to her at the time. If you read that carefully. Now, I don't know about your state, but in Florida, under the age of 16 cannot consent to have sex. This is a 14-year-old. And the officer leading up to this has said, well, was it 10 times or was it 2 times? And is giving her a hard time. And she's going, oh, so now you're telling me you and your brother voluntarily having sex with each other? Keep in mind, her brother is a convicted sex offender. Go on from there. The officer says, well, why did you lie about it years ago? Now, let me explain to you what that means. This child was living in a household with her mother, and the mother has an older child that's a half-sibling that was accused and actually eventually convicted of sexually abusing a toddler niece. And this child knows that her mother never believed that the half-brother would have done that to the niece, even though he was convicted. And that was several years ago. But because there was a report on that young child, and this child was in the same household having access by that older half-brother, they brought her in, at that time, by the way, to a child advocacy center. And she had said nothing had happened. And that was when she was about 11 or 12 years old. Then, can we go back to that slide? Go back one slide. So you can see she didn't want to talk about it. The reason she was saying I didn't admit it was because she lived with her mom. And it was too dangerous for her to talk about it. And so she shut down. And then the officer kept on her on this occasion after the aunt called her and the child wanted to talk about what had been going on all these years. The officer starts raising her voice, and in fact in court as she's retelling it, she's really quite loud. And I even challenged her saying, is that the tone you used with this child? What tone are you talking about? I don't know what tone you're talking about. And this was a female officer. As it went on, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, as it goes on, the child in this case was called by her defense attorney to testify, and she goes, that is the tone she used. She yelled at me, Judge. And keep in mind, this is an untrained officer who thinks she knows how to deal with children and crimes. She knows that he's been convicted. She knows that the child has in the past been removed from her mother and has an open dependency case for failure to protect. And even though this officer is familiar with the Children Advocacy Center, and despite the reality that we know statistically, and I would hope this officer has received some training, that offenders admit where particularly children recant. And despite that, the officer files it as a complaint with the state attorney, who shockingly, sadly, files it then as a criminal charge, a delinquency charge, against this child. This is horrific, and the state attorney only backed down enough to reduce it from a felony to a misdemeanor, instead of filing as a false crime as failure to cooperate with law enforcement. In the end, I dismissed this case. I denied it. We had no choice but to go to an adjudicatory hearing. The motion to dismiss, the state had filed documents that would require us to have an evidentiary hearing. So that's the bad. And this child suffered needlessly. And all of the things that Chris has talked about are what are likely to happen if you don't have the right intervention. So you need to know what your resources are in your community, and you need to know your therapist. Now, if we go to the next slide, it is important to know, are all these different questions. You've got to ask questions. Now, just so you know, and maybe since you saw this webinar coming up, maybe you went online and you typed in National Children's Advocacy Center. I went online and typed in Child Advocacy Centers, Florida. And I came up with a current list and a website where you can find all of the centers. We have 67 counties, and it shows me currently we have 55. It's grown a great deal since the center that we have in my county began. And these, you can be sure then that if you use one of these centers, they are trauma-informed. You know that they are able to handle issues involving children that have been traumatized, whether it is one that, and if you need to be asking questions also of your child protective investigators and your local law enforcement and your state attorneys. Are you aware of this? Are you using this wonderful resource we have in this county or the neighboring county? And certainly in the map in Florida, you don't have to go very far before you can find one. But I know that sometimes in cases, be they family law cases where there's allegations of some sex abuse, whether it is it's coming in criminal cases, it's possible you could be using another therapist. And particularly when we have some dependency cases and we have children in foster care, we need to have some in-home services or services to help a child that maybe it hasn't even been confirmed that they've been a victim of sex abuse. You need to be checking to see if the therapists you're using know what they're doing. Because I have been shocked when I've had a child in foster care who the foster parents don't know how to handle the behaviors, that scale that Chris just showed of how the behaviors can improve. And when I asked to see the credentials of the therapist that our child protection agency is using, they have 0 credentials to be doing this. And then you have to make sure that we get a shift to use the Child Advocacy Center. And all of those satisfactions that Chris talks about, I can tell you that our cases have been astounding as to the turnaround. Our program offers so many services, of course, that are trauma-based, but they offer the non-offending parent. So I might have a parent who has a boyfriend or a husband or somebody in the picture that they discover has offended against their child. They didn't know, maybe they did know and they didn't understand, but we bring them in and suddenly they go through this wonderful program that is therapeutic with the child, that is the non-offending parent and the child, and they have a safe atmosphere with a trauma-informed therapist who will work them through it, and they also build safety for the child. The change is traumatic. I have parents that will divorce somebody that they married. They will move out of the area once all the services are completed because they want to make their children safe. And a child who didn't feel safe before saying, my mom didn't understand, she didn't do anything. And the younger child that may not have been a victim yet but is very worried they could be, the results of using the wonderful trauma-informed therapist in a children's advocacy center will transform the future of that child. It will transform the relationship to that child. It will allow a child to not remain in out-of-home care but be in a safe, protective home. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see locally, and I'm sure that your programs as well have a lot of services. And so you can see these are among the services that we have that have been extraordinary in healing our children. I do want to make sure you understand as well that one of the critical reasons we need to do this now, and I'll talk about for those services on that next slide in just a moment, but the reason this is so critical is we now understand in human trafficking that so many of the children that get tapped out on the street are children that are runaways. They're runaways from home, they're runaway from foster care, and often they have ended up there, and maybe we haven't even discovered all of the trauma that has occurred to them, such as sex abuse by a boyfriend, a parent, an uncle, an older brother, a half-sibling. And they're out on the street, and they are vulnerable. We need to stop that pipeline. If we can heal these children, if we can teach the non-offending parent how to protect that child, we're going to cut down on those children heading into the pipeline. If we go on to that next slide, one of the services that we have offered locally is a protective capacity assessment. And there may be a variety of reasons it may come before the court, but particularly in child abuse, abandonment, and neglect cases, and even in some of my domestic violence injunctions, I need to know that that parent gets it, that they understand that that boyfriend or girlfriend who is abusing that child is not a good idea. And the protective capacity is a very involved assessment that will let me know there's various categories that they go through and they outline to let me know whether that parent understands how to put the child's needs first. And if they find that they're not protective, they're going to tell me steps that that parent needs to undergo. And then they can offer these other services. It is very important that if you find out if you have those and you use these services. Because if we go on to the next, we are going to ideally get to a point where we're going to be able to do some healing for the child, and sometimes education is needed. If we go to the next slide, the therapeutic visitation has been very helpful. Where we have a child often that feels, in essence, abandoned or wronged, as I described in one of those cases I told you, they don't want to have contact with that child. And in some cases, we have offenders who maybe it's physical abuse, maybe it's emotional trauma, and sometimes sexual abuse. If that parent has gone through their own adequate counseling, it may be appropriate to bring them in and do some therapeutic visitation, sometimes only for the purpose of the child being heard that they do not wish to have that contact. All guided. I'm not the therapist, but we have excellent therapists in a child advocacy center who can help with that. They also offer these other services, and the training that's an untapped resource, I suspect, in a lot of areas in the country. I know I have worked with our trauma-informed program manager at our CAC. She and I have trained locally. We've trained on a statewide basis, and it is an untapped resource. I urge you to do that and see what they can offer, and you can bring for continuing eds, you can bring to your guardian ad litems, you can bring and offer to law enforcement. They do a lot of training for all of those people in our area. And before I conclude, I want to go on to what you heard mentioned, the one family, one judge model. I've been doing that for a number of years. And for those of you who have unified family courts, I consider this unified family court on steroids, because not only are we trying to do one judge and one family, we want to make sure that we have a trauma overlay. In other words, that we're trauma informed, that everybody who touches the life of a child has trauma. It is amazing the trust that can build when you have a collaborative model and we're all coming together, that I'm doing the delinquency, I'm doing the dependency, I'm doing the divorce and paternity, I'm doing whatever it's going to take to meet the needs of this child and these parents. And we do not want to re-traumatize the child, and we don't want to, we have parents that have been traumatized, and we can trigger them unless we realize it, and that's why we always try to look at the cases with a trauma lens and offer healing that may go back a generation. And some of our perpetrators were victims as well, and we don't want to have conflicting services. We, of course, always want to coordinate our cases to reduce the stress. It's very stressful when you know you're coming to court. We can go to the next slide, for a parent or a child. And so we make sure we have adequate time. Things are set for time certain. They're set to bring in and notice what issues we might be dealing with that child or that family. And it gives us an opportunity, by putting all the overlay and the coordination on one family, to truly assist in changing the trajectory, the future for this child and this family. And you'll see the web reference to the Florida courts, and if you were to hit that, one of the things you're going to come up with, and we'll go to the next slide, are the Big Ten. Thanks to the Office of Court Improvement, we have the most remarkable wealth of information on our website through the Florida courts, and this is the Big Ten. And you can go on to each of these areas, and you will get all of the referrals that you need, the language explained, examples of how to communicate, and all about trauma and how even self-care. If you go on to the next website, we're going to show you a picture of what, and then we had to break it into two, but what the opening page looks like. And as you can see, you can click on home, the problem, the solution, the goal. This is the most remarkable interactive website that you're going to find, I think, anywhere in the country. And where it says resources, that's where you're going to find, and at the end of this, we're going to show you the best, most up-to-date resources around the country on a trauma-informed court. And we believe in Florida that you should presume trauma. We can go back to that slide. We have to recognize that children and parents that we're dealing with may be injured. and we have to change that trajectory. And that's why, if we go to the next slide, we have to make sure that everybody in our community, law enforcement, therapists, attorneys, guardian ad litem, case managers, indeed understand and are in a position that we recognize that there might be a need for screening, that there might be a need to have assessments, and we always want to make sure it's evidence-based. And then we close, you can see all of these resources that you find on this and the next page are all found on the Florida Court's website. They're extraordinary, and take the time. You could get lost in these. And we have the obligation and we have an opportunity with the Children's Advocacy Center to indeed meet the trauma needs of our children and our families and change their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge Tepper, and thank you, Chris. That was very great. Thank you for the information that you've shared. I want to ask, of course, as you are, there's some questions coming in, and we will get to those. I did want to open the poll, Sarah, just so we know who is on the line. So there's a poll that's going to come up that says, what is your discipline? And if you could, there's also what state are you from? I don't know if we can do both at the same time, but it would be helpful for us to know who's on the line as we take questions and respond to questions. So please fill out that poll.
I was going to say, while they're doing that, I see a question typed up, and I wondered if I answered that question on the one judge, one family. I didn't see if that came in as I was explaining the process. I get all, in my area, all child abuse cases, not the criminal ones. I get all domestic violence. I get all of the related family, be they paternity, child support, family law, post or pre-final judgment. I get all of the related delinquencies. And occasionally I will get a criminal case. In Florida, unfortunately, juveniles can be filed against as adults, and I often get those cases that I handle. And I have no special paid staff to help. We just use all of the resources through our clerk and my office and any existing case managers and family courts.
And Michelle, to your question, this is Crystal Duarte with the National Council. That is something that we're working with several courts on, is how they can become more connected across case types and get that type of information. That's what our Project One courts are attempting to do. And there are some great examples in Judge Tepper's court and also in Multnomah County, which is Portland, Oregon, where the judges on a family law case can actually maintain the or oversee the probation or parole of an adult that's also part of a case on their caseload. So in that way, they are able to make sure that there aren't conflicting orders.
And by the way, in criminal cases in county court, the county judges give me the authority if somebody has been arrested and it's a no contact, let's say, with a child, but there's a dependency case and we're going through all of this therapy and maybe we need to change it, I have the authority to enter an order in that criminal case to modify it to be consistent with our child abuse dependency case.
So we have a lot more time here for questions. So it does look like we have a mix of participants, the majority being forensic interviewers, and I can't see the other category at this point, but people in the legal profession. Thank you. We have quite a few states represented as well. So since we have more time for questions, I wanted to see if I don't see anybody typing any, so I'll ask one of my own. Judge Tepper, can you tell us some specifics about how you've created a trauma-informed court within, really tightly focused on within your courtroom?
Well, I had received education through some experts at that I went to programs and I was teaching with and began to learn and read articles. But then we were able, through Florida has the Office of Court Improvement. We all probably have some federal money for that. And we asked them if they would pay for one of the best experts in, frankly, the state to come in and do a training. And so we did I think it was 3.5-hour training, and they paid to have we actually even rented a room where it was a good learning environment, and we filled it. She did a PowerPoint. She gave out materials. I had people from my detention center, from the top to some of the chaplain in the detention center. I had guardian ad litems. I had attorneys for child welfare. I had parents' attorneys. I had some of our other providers in the area, local community behavioral health programs. And they came and learned, and it was a remarkable experience for everybody. And we arranged for continuing legal ed and continuing ed for other disciplines. And I've also had somebody from our advocacy center, she and I put on a lunch webinar, not a webinar, but a lunch program on trauma and attachment and the impact of breaking the bond with a child. We've also, I have a listserv, and when I get a lot of the cutting edge information on science, I share it with individuals. And in court, I also try to do a form of psychoeducation with my parents. We have a wide variety of materials that I have accumulated, and we give each parent a packet when they first come to dependency court that gives them some information that will help them on brain development and things like that. That isn't trauma per se, but we're giving them information so that when they, and by the way, when you walk into my courtroom, I have 2 huge stuffed bears, and I have food for parents, I have juice for kids, I have raisins, I have peanut bars, I have library, I have not library books, I've created libraries of books for parents to take. I have books for children. We have condoms even on the tables, but they know it's a place where they can come and talk and they're comfortable. And we try to open, sessions by saying, how are you today? And as they go along and they see that actually we are going to listen, that their attorneys are going to listen, the case management, and we're going to give them services, it begins to be a vast change. And I've had a parent say to me, wow, I've never had a judge talk to me like that before. And children, say, I want to come to court, Judge. I'm comfortable here. I'm not on edge when I'm here. And that's very different than the typical adversarial type of courtroom that, frankly, I had many years ago. Does that answer? I didn't want to take up too much time.
Well, thank you. Yeah, there's been a couple other questions that have come in. And I think, Marcia, your question may be pretty specific to what you're seeing in your community in regard to different types of allegations being withdrawn.
I'm reading it now. I'm sorry to hear that child abuse or endangerment charges are dismissed. It is sometimes harder to get prosecutors on board. And I know I need to make a little bit more time, and they're open to me doing some programs where particularly they can get free CLEs. I'm constantly sending them information. And I have taught, by the way, at the statewide Prosecutors Association. I'm teaching this next month at our statewide public defenders program on trauma. I'm able to do a plenary program on that. We just have to keep finding experts in our area, if it isn't us, and communicate with the state attorney's office and law enforcement and the defense bar, because that's not all that's going to do is solve today's problem. That's not going to solve tomorrow's problem, and that doesn't mean that there may not still be a child dependency case even if they drop the child abuse charges. I hope that helps. And I see that there was, I think that answers Marcia's questions.
Yeah, and then Chris was able to answer a question about...
the allegations of child abuse. Not all allegations of sex abuse and child abuse result in criminal charges. The most egregious ones do end up with criminal charges. And frankly, often it's a boyfriend or even a girlfriend that is being prosecuted, not necessarily a parent, though sometimes a parent is in our jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. We have just actually only 2 minutes remaining, so it might be good now. If you do have a question, get it in there. We'll try to answer it. But we do have a survey. It looks like it's a web link. Sarah, can you tell us more about how they should access that? I don't know if maybe it's something that's going to open at the close of the webinar.
Yes, they can open the survey now. You also will get, if you registered through us in our Adobe Connect, which everybody did, in about an hour you're going to get access to the survey. And the survey, if you'll go through and just let us know how we did, that will be fantastic. Under the Files tab, I also left up the NCTSN bench card and also put the handouts from this presentation on what judges should know. That's the second item under Files. And if there's any other information you guys need from this, please contact us. We do not mind sharing what we can.
Thank you. And so in addition to the survey, we do have a quick question in a poll that we wanted to ask just to get some feedback on how comfortable you are in applying what you might have learned today. I know it was a lot of information in a short time frame, and some of the content was particularly challenging to hear. I know everyone on the line probably deals with these types of cases all the time, so I would recommend that you take a look at Judge Tepper and Florida's top 10 and definitely take number 10 very seriously, which was to be good to yourself. And I hope you'll be able to do that today. And
by the way, it actually has examples of how to communicate in a trauma-informed way versus a non-trauma-informed way. It actually gives you some examples. Don't do this, do this.
Well, that's very helpful to know. I know a lot of people benefit from the specific do and don't do, so thank you for adding that. I would recommend you download the What Judges Should Know About Trauma in the files, and you'll have access to those resources that Judge Tepper shared. Thank you so much for filling out our last poll, and I really thank you if you fill out that survey as well. And thank you to our presenters, Judge Tepper and Chris. We appreciate it so much, and if you have any follow-up questions, I can type my email address into this chat. I think that's where I'm typing it. So please get in touch. Please visit our website, and I hope you have a wonderful